Hey guys, welcome back. TJ here with Dead History, and welcome to part 2 of our next Vice Presidential Series installment, taking a look at the 7th Vice President of the United States, John C. Calhoun. So, yesterday was, of course, part 1. We took a look at the early life and early political career of John C. Calhoun, and, of course, him meeting his wife and a little bit about that. And now, part 2 today, we're going to dive right into his vice presidency, his legacy, and all the things that go along with John C. Calhoun. And then, of course, his death, and, of course, his gravesite and that sort of thing, because obviously that's what we do here, as always. So, we're going to jump right in because there's a lot to go over as far as John C. Calhoun is concerned. So let's just dive right in. Here we go. John Calhoun declared himself a candidate for the presidency in December of 1821. Much to the surprise of Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, widely considered to be Monroe's heir apparent by virtue of his office. Calhoun and Adams were friends, both avid nationalists. They had also been political allies until the Missouri crisis in 1820 exposed their profound disagreement over slavery. Calhoun, however, became convinced that Adams was too weak a candidate to defeat Crawford, who enjoyed a significant following within the Congressional Nominating Caucus. The South Carolinian, determined to prevent Crawford's election at any cost, therefore decided to become a candidate himself. In addition to Calhoun, Adams, and Crawford, the crowded field of prospective candidates for 1824 soon included House Speaker Henry Clay and the revered hero of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson, all Republicans. Calhoun believed that he was the only candidate who could command a national following. He had been warmly received during a visit to the northern and middle states in 1820, and his efforts to strengthen the nation's defenses had won him a following in the West as well. His quest, however, lost momentum after the South Carolina legislature voted to endorse another favorite son, William Lowndes. Not only did Calhoun face formidable opposition from Crawford's supporters, now ably led by New York Senator Martin Van Buren, but to the amazement of many, Jackson soon emerged as a leading contender. Calhoun's Pennsylvania supporters eventually declared for Jackson, endorsing Calhoun as their vice presidential candidate. As other states followed suit, the ambitious young Secretary of War was, in one scholar's words, everybody's second choice. Thus, in the general election, Calhoun was overwhelmingly elected vice president with support from both the Jackson and Adams camps. None of the presidential candidates, however, achieved an electoral majority, although Jackson received a plurality. The election was therefore thrown into the House of Representatives, where each state delegation had a single vote. Having come in fourth in the general election, Clay was not a contender in the House balloting, but he played a pivotal part in determining the outcome by persuading the delegations of the three states he had carried, Ohio, Kentucky, and Missouri, to vote for Adams. These three western states, as well as New York, after heavy lobbying by Clay and Massachusetts Representative Daniel Webster, gave Adams the margin he needed to defeat Jackson. Clay's maneuvering and his subsequent appointment as Adams' Secretary of State deeply offended Calhoun, nudging him toward the Jackson camp. He would probably have coalesced With the Jacksonians in any event, one scholar of the period has surmised, since South Carolina and Pennsylvania, the two states crucial to Calhoun's abortive presidential strategy, had gone for Jackson. But politics alone could not fully account for Calhoun's shift. He knew that the Kentucky legislature had expressly instructed its delegation to vote for Jackson, who had run second to Clay in the general election. Yet at Clay's urging, the Kentuckians had cast their state's vote for Adams, who had received few, if any, popular votes in the state. Mr. Clay has made the president against the voice of his constituents, Calhoun confided to a friend, and has been rewarded by the man elevated by him by the first office in his gift, the most dangerous stab which the liberty of this country has ever received. So now just to look quickly at the 1824 election. Of course, this is kind of known as the corrupt bargain by Henry Clay. And as you see here, Adams, it was so strange. This was so odd. Jackson actually won the electoral vote 99 to 84. Jackson won 11 states. Quincy Adams only won 7. Jackson won the popular vote by a decent margin. It was very interesting. William H. Crawford, he got 41 electoral votes. Henry Clay got 37. It was crazy. You can see all this here on the screen, and how this worked out. It was very, very, very interesting. That's for sure. That was the controversial, very controversial, presidential election of 1824, where John Quincy Adams did become the president of the United States, and John Calhoun became the vice president. But, Jackson probably actually did really win, but, it was just a whole mess. So that was the 1824 presidential election. I'm sure you're seeing on your screen here maps and different graphs and that sort of thing. So there you go. That's kind of what we just went over with John Calhoun, the 1824 election. Now we're going to be talking about the Senate and how they examine the role of the presiding officer. So we're going to get into Calhoun as vice president now. So here we go. Wholly lacking in experience as a presiding officer, John Calhoun prepared himself for his new responsibilities by studying Jefferson's Manual of Parliamentary Practice and other parliamentary authorities. But even this rigorous course of study could not adequately prepare him for the challenges he would face. The Senate experiencing growing pains as it completed its transformation from the Chamber of Revision envisioned by the Constitution's framers to a full-fledged legislative body in its own right, was beginning to reconsider rules and procedures that seemed outdated or impractical. As the Senate's debates became increasingly contentious, the body began rethinking the role of its presiding officer as well. Calhoun's difficulties began shortly after the 19th Congress convened in December of 1825, when he announced appointments to the Senate's Standing Committee. Prior to 1823, the Senate had elected committee members by ballot, an awkward and time-consuming process. The rule was revised during the 18th Congress to provide that all committees shall be appointed by the presiding officer of this House, unless specially ordered otherwise by the Senate. Before Calhoun became vice president, the new procedure had been used only once, on December 9th of 1823, the day the Senate adopted the revised rule. On that occasion, Vice President Daniel Tompkins was absent, a frequent occurrence during his troubled tenure, and President pro tempore John Gaylord of South Carolina had appointed the chairman and members of the Senate's standing committees. As one scholar of the period has noted, Calhoun made an honest effort to divide control of the committees between friends and enemies of the administration. An analysis of his appointment suggests that he took into account a senator's experience. He reappointed 9 of the 15 standing committee chairmen whom Gaylord had chosen 2 years earlier. The 2 chairmen who had left the Senate he replaced with individuals who had previously served on the respective committees. Of the 4 remaining committees, 3 were chaired by senators friendly to the administration. After Military Affairs Committee Chairman Andrew Jackson resigned his seat in October of 1825, Calhoun chose as his replacement the only member of the Senate whose military record could match Jackson's, Senator William Henry Harrison, the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe. As a result of Calhoun's appointments, senators hostile to the administration retained or gained control of several important committees. Maryland Senator Samuel Smith, a Crawford Republican who would eventually join the Jackson camp, remained in charge of the influential Finance Committee, while New York Senator Martin Van Buren, who would soon unite the opposition forces behind Andrew Jackson, continued to chair the Judiciary Committee. Administration supporters were outraged to learn that the Foreign Relations Committee included only one Adams Clay man, and that its new chairman was Nathaniel Macon of North Carolina, who had voted against confirming Clay as Secretary of State. Bitter divisions between administration supporters and the opposition forces were beginning to infect the Senate, and Calhoun, in his attempt to please everyone, had satisfied no one. The pro-administration Philadelphia Democratic Press and several other papers vehemently criticized Calhoun, publishing unfounded allegations that he had made the offending appointments after Adams ignored Calhoun's demand to dissociate himself from Henry Clay. In the meantime, Senator Van Buren had enlisted Calhoun's support for a concerted challenge to the expansive agenda that President Adams outlined in his December 6, 1825 annual message to Congress. Adams had proposed a national university, a national observatory, and a network of internal improvements unprecedented in the nation's history, as well as foreign policy initiatives. In particular, Calhoun, not yet the strict constructionist he would later become, was concerned that Adams' plan to send observers to a conference of South and Central American ministers scheduled to meet in Panama that following year would reinvigorate the sectional tensions that emerged during the Missouri crisis. Calhoun saw United States participation in the Panama Congress as a perilous first step toward extending diplomatic recognition to Haiti, a nation of former slaves. He had cautioned Adams through an intermediary that the initiative would, in the present tone of feelings in the South, lead to great mischief. But Clay, an early and enthusiastic supporter of the Latin American independence movements, had prevailed. The president sent the names of prospective delegates to Panama to the Senate for approval in late December of 1825, touching off a protracted and contentious debate that continued through March 14th of 1826, when the Senate approved the mission by a narrow margin. Missouri Senator Thomas Hart Benton later reflected that no question in its day excited more heat and intemperate discussion or more feeling between a president and Senate than this proposed mission. Although the vice president had no vote, the constitutional contingency to authorize it not having occurred. Bennett recalled Calhoun had been full and free in the expression of his opinion against the mission. It was a costly victory for the administration. The United States delegation arrived too late to have any impact on the deliberations, and all but one of the Latin American republics failed to ratify the accords approved at the convention. The president had wasted a great deal of political capital in a confrontation that hardened the party divisions in the Senate, and Calhoun and Van Buren had taken the first tentative steps toward an alliance that would drive Adams from office in the next election. Calhoun also endorsed the opposition's efforts to curtail the powers of the executive through constitutional amendments to abolish the Electoral College and to limit the president to 2 terms. Although the Senate had considered similar amendments in previous sessions, the move acquired a new urgency after the 1824 election. Thomas Hart Benton renewed the initiative on December 15th of 1825 with a resolution to appoint a select committee to inquire into the expediency of choosing the president and vice president by a direct vote of the people in districts. Other senators suggested amendments to provide for the election of the president and vice president without the intervention of the Senate or House of Representatives, and to prohibit the appointment of any member of Congress to any office of honor or trust under the United States during the term for which such senator or representative should have been elected. The latter proposal represented an obvious slap at Secretary of State Henry Clay, who had resigned from the House to take the executive post. Calhoun appointed Benton chairman of the Select Committee, which the Senate directed to determine the best, most preferable, and safest mode in regard to such elections. Benton was pleased that the other members of the 9-man Select Committee were carefully selected both geographically as coming from different sections of the Union and personally and politically as being friendly to the object. Only one, Senator John Holmes of Maine, was an Adams man. Calhoun had appointed the administration's most vocal critics to the committee, which reported to the Senate on January 19th of 1826, a constitutional amendment calling for the direct election of the president and vice president. Calhoun confided to a correspondent that he expected the administration to resist all attempts that can limit or counteract the effects of patronage. They will in particular resist any amendment of the Constitution, he predicted, which will place the presidential election in the hands of the voters, where patronage can have little or no effect. As for John Calhoun, he promised that no one who knows me can doubt where I will be found. The constitutional debate over the Select Committee's report took an unexpected turn on March 30th of 1826 when Virginia Senator John Randolph rose to address the Senate after North Carolina Senator John Branch offered a resolution protesting the president's appointment of ministers to the Panama Congress without the advice and consent of the Senate. Randolph was a diehard old Republican, a strict constructionist, and a resolute opponent of change in any form. Stubbornly clinging to the customs, attire, and rhetoric of a bygone era, he regarded any departure from the dicta of the Founding Fathers as tantamount to hearsay. Calhoun thought him highly talented, eloquent, severe, and eccentric, while others alternately amused and offended by his rambling and caustic speeches, his 18th century dress and manners, and his bizarre behavior dismissed him as thoroughly insane. His March 30th address was vintage Randolph, a disjointed litany of personal grievances, interspersed with his objections to the administration, the Panama Congress, and the practice that the Secretary of State shall succeed the President. Calhoun remained silent as the agitated Virginian took Adams to task for elevating patronage above patriotism, buying us up with our own money, and suggested that Clay had manufactured the invitation to the Panama Congress. Even Randolph's likening of Adams and Clay to Blifil and Black George, two unsavory characters from the popular novel Tom Jones, brought no rebuke from the chair. After Randolph ended his harangue, the Senate turned to the Select Committee report. Randolph, trumpeting his opposition to all amendments to the Constitution, moved to table the report. New Jersey Senator Malin Dickerson, who had spoke at great length the previous day in support of his own proposal to limit the president to 2 terms in office, prepared to speak in opposition to Randolph's motion. He had just started to explain his position when Calhoun cut him short, ruling him out of order on the grounds that the motion now pending did not admit of debate. Randolph added that it is unreasonable, after having spoken an hour and 35 minutes the previous day, to speak again today, and explained that he would oppose any effort to amend the Constitution. When Dickerson attempted to respond to Randolph's remarks, Calhoun ruled him out of order a second time. Randolph finally agreed to Dickerson's request to postpone the discussion until the next day, bringing the awkward exchange to an end. On April 3rd of 1826, the Senate approved the Select Committee's amendment providing for the direct election of the President and Vice President. Fallout from the explosive session of March 30th of 1826 would haunt Calhoun for the remainder of his term. Deeply offended at Randolph's charges, Clay demanded a duel with the Virginian. The resulting nerve-wracking but bloodless encounter ended with a handshake after 2 exchanges of fire. Those who had expressed amusement at Randolph's March 30th performance or agreed with him in principle were suddenly sobered at the thought that the vice president's failure to restrain an intemperate senator had resulted in a near tragedy. Calhoun's enemies criticized him for twice calling the sedate and congenial Dickerson to order while permitting Randolph to vent his spleen at will. In the following weeks, the Senate, for the first time in its history, attempted to define the vice president's legislative duties and responsibilities. In the decade prior to 1826, the Senate had paid increasing attention to organizational matters, a clear indication of its increased workload, enlarged membership, and heightened importance as a national forum. It had established standing committees in 1816, revised its rules in 1820, and required the publication of regular financial reports by the Secretary of the Senate after 1823. The body also enhanced the powers of the chair. Not only had it authorized the presiding officer in 1823 to appoint members of standing and select committees, but in 1824, it also directed the presiding officer to examine and correct the journals before they are read, and to have the regulation of such parts of the Capitol as are set apart for the use of the Senate and its officers. These changes reflect an institution in transition, conscious of its changing role in a rapidly altering political environment. After the March 30th, 1826 spectacle, however, any discussion of Senate rules inevitably invited comment on the Vice President's legislative duties and on Calhoun's conduct as President of the Senate. On April 13th of 1826, John Randolph offered a motion to rescind so much of the new rules of this House which give to the presiding officer of this body the appointment of its committees and the control over the journal of its proceedings. The debate continued on April 15th as several Calhoun supporters, including Martin Van Buren, reviewed the considerations that had led the Senate to change its rules in 1823 and 1824. The fragmentary published accounts in the Register of Debates suggest that when the Senate vested in the presiding officer the power to appoint committees, it had done so assuming that the president pro tempore would actually make the selections, a reasonable assumption when the debilitated Daniel D. Tompkins served as vice president. Randolph's cryptic remarks on April 12th, when he notified the Senate that he would propose the rules changes on the following day, also hint that the Senate had given the presiding officer the responsibility of supervising the journal because the Secretary of the Senate had been negligent in performing this important task. The reporter who followed the April 15th debate was careful to note that the gentleman who favored the present motion, as well as the one who offered it, disclaimed the remotest intention to impute to the vice president an improper exercise of the duties devolved on him by the rules. But the debate took a personal turn after Randolph, sensitive to mounting and widespread criticism of Calhoun for failing to stifle his recent outburst, asserted that it is not the duty nor the right of the President of the Senate to call a member to order. That right, Randolph argued, was reserved to members of the Senate. At the conclusion of the debate, the Senate voted by overwhelming margins to resume its former practice of selecting committee members by ballot and to take from the President of the Senate the control over the journal of the proceedings. Some contemporary observers, as well as modern-day scholars, have interpreted the April 15th vote as a pointed rebuke of a vice president who had exceeded his authority and offended the Senate. On the other hand, the caveats of Van Buren and opposition senators suggest that, although some senators may well have intended to curtail Calhoun's authority, others were animated by concern for maintaining the Senate's institutional prerogatives. Calhoun, edging toward the strict constructionist stance he would champion in later years, seems to have approved of the changes, or at least to have accepted them with his customary grace. No power ought to be delegated which can be fairly exercised by the constituent body, he agreed shortly after the vote, and none ought ever to be delegated but to responsible agents, and I should be inconsistent with myself if I did not give my entire assent to the principles on which the rules in question have been rescinded. Calhoun did bristle, however, at the suggestion that he had been negligent in not calling Randolph to order. He had diligently studied the Senate's rules. He informed the senators and had concluded that although the chair could issue rulings on procedural matters, the right to call to order on questions touching the latitude or freedom of debate belongs exclusively to the members of this body and not to the chair. The power of the presiding officer is an appellate power. only, and the duties of the chair commence when a senator is called to order by a senator. He had been elected vice president by the people, he reminded the Senate. He had laid it down as an invariable rule to assume no power in the least degree doubtful. The debate over the vice president's role in the Senate continued a month later on May 19th. A select committee chaired by Randolph that had been appointed to take into consideration the present arrangement of the Senate chamber reported a resolution that would make access to the Senate floor by anyone other than past and current members of Congress and certain members of the executive and judicial branches contingent upon written authorization by the Vice President. The resolution also specified that the officers of the Senate would be responsible to the Vice President and that all, except for the Secretary of the Senate, would be subject to immediate removal for any neglect of duty. The Senate chamber would be arranged under the direction of the Vice President so as to keep order more effectively in the lobby and in the gallery. A change intended to regulate the crowds who were flocking to the Senate galleries in increasing numbers. As the first session of the 19th Congress neared its end, Senator John Holmes submitted a resolution for consideration in the next session to appoint a committee that would consider rules to clarify and enhance the powers of the chair. Randolph moved to take up the Holmes resolution immediately, but Calhoun ruled him out of order on the grounds that when a member offered a resolution, if he did not desire its consideration, it would lie one day on the table. Undaunted, Randolph moved to instruct the committee that it would be inconsistent with the rights and privileges of the states to authorize the chair to call a member. He then proceeded to castigate a Massachusetts editor for his alleged misconduct in the chamber. The debate degenerated into a shouting match after Massachusetts Senator James Lloyd rose to defend his constituent, but Calhoun remained impassive until Alabama Senator William R. King intervened with a call to order. Rigidly adhering to the Senate's rule governing the conduct of debate, Calhoun instructed King to reduce the exceptionable words to writing. King responded that it was not necessary to reduce the words to writing, since he had merely intended to check the gentlemen when they were giving way to irreverence of feeling. Calhoun explained that he had no power beyond the rules of the Senate. If King would not comply, Randolph was free to continue. After Randolph finished his diatribe, Calhoun again reminded the Senate that the chair would never assume any power not vested in it. A weary Calhoun left the chair on May 20th of 1826, 2 days before the 19th Congress adjourned, in order to allow for the election of a president pro tempore. But the controversy over his conduct in the Senate continued throughout the spring and summer and into fall. On April 24th, the National Intelligencer had published a letter from Senator Dickerson, who maintained that Calhoun had treated him with appropriate courtesy and respect during the March 30th debate, as well as a submission from an anonymous Western senator defending the vice president. On May 1st, the pro-administration National Journal published the first in a series of 5 articles by Patrick Henry, an anonymous writer friendly to the administration, charging that Calhoun had abused his office. These essays, which continued through August 8th, cited an impressive array of parliamentary scholarship to support the author's contention that Calhoun had been negligent in permitting the irrelative rhapsodies of a once powerful mind to disturb the Senate without one effort of authority or one hint of disappropriation from its president. The vice president had also allowed selfish considerations to influence his committee appointments, Henry charged. From the commencement of the government until the last session of Congress, the essayist scolded Calhoun in his August 4th installment. Order had been preserved in the Senate under every vice president, and decorum, almost rising to solemnity, had been a distinctive feature of its proceedings. But no sooner were you sent to preside over it than its hall became, as if by some magic agency, transformed into an arena where political disappointment rioted in its madness. Modern scholars have never conclusively established the identity of the Patrick Henry. It's not the real Patrick Henry, of course. That was the name that this essayist used. Although John Calhoun and many others believed him to be President Adams. The vice president responded in his own series of essays published in the National Intelligencer between May 20th and October 12th of 1826 under the pseudonym Onslow, in honor of a distinguished 18th century speaker of the British House of Commons. Echoing Calhoun's pronouncements in the Senate, the writer's opening salvo offered a forceful defense of the vice president's refusal to restrain the latitude or freedom of debate. The decision to rule Dickerson out of order had involved a procedural matter well within the scope of the vice president's authority. Silencing Randolph's outbursts would have required a despotic power worse than the sedition law. As for the vice president's committee appointments, Onslow maintained in his October 12th epistle, the only correct rule is to appoint the able, experienced, and independent without regard to their feelings toward the executive. To appoint only pro-administration partisans, he argued, would have drastically expanded the power of an executive who already had the whole patronage of the government at his disposal. These arguments, the modern era editors of Calhoun's papers have stressed, reveal the ground principles of all of Calhoun's later thinking and mark the turning point in Calhoun's career from nationalist and latitudinarian to sectionalist and strict constructionist. Not until 1828 did the Senate finally revise the rule governing debates to authorize the presiding officer or any senator to call a member to order. After this revision was adopted, Calhoun stubbornly remarked that it was not for him to comment on the change, assuring the Senate that he should always endeavor to exercise it with strict impartiality. He did heartily approve of another change adopted in 1828, a revision that made rulings of the chair subject to appeal. It was not only according to strict principle, he informed the Senate, but would relieve the chair from a most delicate duty. Now we're going to get into Calhoun and Andrew Jackson and their alliance. On June 4th of 1826, John Calhoun notified Andrew Jackson that he would support his 1828 presidential bid. Calhoun, with his disciplined intellect and rigid sense of propriety, presented a striking contrast to the popular and dashing military hero. The two were never close, and Calhoun never completely trusted Jackson. In fact, several years earlier, while serving in Monroe's cabinet, the South Carolinian had urged the president to discipline Jackson for his unauthorized invasion of Spanish Florida during the Seminole War. But Calhoun needed time to recoup his political fortunes, and Jackson had vowed to serve but a single term if elected president. The old hero welcomed Calhoun's support, assuring him that they would march hand in hand in the people's cause, cementing one of the most ill-starred partnerships in the history of the vice presidency. When Calhoun returned to the Senate for the second session of the 19th Congress in early December, he was relieved to find that he was not the object of the malignant attack of those in power. He did observe, however, that in the Senate, the line of separation is better drawn and the feelings on both sides higher than in the last session. Calhoun's respite came to an abrupt halt on December 28th when the Alexandria, Virginia Phoenix Gazette, an administration mouthpiece, resurrected the old charges that Calhoun's chief secretary at the War Department had improperly profited from his interest in a materials contract. On the following day, Calhoun notified its Secretary of the Senate, Walter Lowry, that he had asked the House of Representatives to investigate the charges and would not preside over the Senate until the matter was resolved. A sense of propriety forbids me from resuming my station till the House has disposed of this subject, he explained. On January 2nd of 1827, the Senate chose Nathaniel Macon of North Carolina to preside over its deliberations while a House Select Committee pursued the allegations. Henry Clay, who still commanded enormous influence in the House of Representatives, played a silent role in the appointment of the House Select Committee, which was heavily weighted against Calhoun. Even though the committee cleared Calhoun after 6 weeks of hearings, press accounts of the investigation combined with the muddled language that Clay had persuaded his allies to insert in the Select Committee's February 13, 1827 report, contributed to the widespread perception that the vice president had done something wrong while serving as Secretary of War. Some Jacksonians would have gladly withdrawn their support for Calhoun's vice presidential bid at that point, but Jackson's chief strategist, Martin Van Buren, insisted that Calhoun was essential to his strategy of forging a coalition of planters of the South and the plain Republicans of the North to drive Adams from the White House. The vice president, for his part, was increasingly disturbed at the concessions that Van Buren seemed willing to make to secure Jackson's election, particularly with respect to the tariff. Van Buren and New York Senator Silas Wright had finessed a protective tariff through the Senate in the spring of 1828. This so-called tariff of abominations included no concessions to Southern agricultural interests as had previous tariffs and imposed severe hardships on the region. Still, Calhoun convinced the South Carolina delegation to hold its fire, fearing that the backlash might cost Jackson the election and hoping that Jackson would, if elected, reform the tariff schedules. The tariff of the last session excites much feelings in this and the other southern Atlantic states, he wrote to Jackson from South Carolina in July, continuing, the belief that those now in power will be displaced shortly, that under an administration formed under your auspices, a better order will commence, in which an equal distribution of the burden and benefit of government, and finally the removal of oppressive duties will be the primary objects of policy, is what mainly consoles this quarter of the Union under existing embarrassment. Jackson and Calhoun won 56% of the popular vote in 1828, a sweeping victory widely acclaimed as a triumph for the common man. The Jacksonians boasted an organization vastly more efficient than that of Adams' National Republicans, a factor that had helped them gain control of both houses in the 1827 congressional elections. The presidential campaign was one of the most bitterly contested in the nation's history. Adams' supporters charged Jackson and his wife with immoral conduct. The two had married before Rachel's divorce from her first husband, and Jacksonians countered by reminding the electorate of the corrupt bargain. Calhoun and the National Republican vice presidential candidate Richard Rush were barely noticed in the fray. Candidate Calhoun had spent most of the election year at Fort Hill, his Pendleton, South Carolina estate, supervising farm operations and, at the request of the South Carolina legislature, preparing a critique of the tariff. His point of departure for the resulting South Carolina exposition was an argument that Jefferson had marshaled 3 decades earlier in his crusade against the Alien and Sedition Acts, that the Union was a compact between states, which retained certain rights under the Constitution. But John Calhoun carried the argument several steps farther, asserting that a state could veto or nullify any act by the federal government that encroached on its sovereignty or otherwise violated the Constitution. The exposition and an accompanying set of protest resolutions were widely circulated by the South Carolina legislature. Calhoun, wary of jeopardizing his national standing, was careful not to claim authorship, but Jackson and Van Buren soon suspected that the vice president had written the controversial tract. Now we're going to get into the nullification, and the nullification surrounding John Calhoun, and then we'll get into some more of the end of his vice presidency and the rest of his political career before we get into his death. So let's get into the nullification now. John Calhoun's second vice presidential term was even more of an ordeal than his first. His suspicions that Jackson might pose as great a threat to popular liberties as his predecessor were soon confirmed. The president failed to repudiate the tariff-clear evidence that he had fallen under Van Buren's spell, and his appointment of the Little Magician as Secretary of State boded ill for Calhoun. The vice president was soon isolated within an administration where Van Buren and his protectionist allies appeared to be gaining the upper hand. Calhoun's novel theory came under attack in the Senate early in his second term, during a debate over the disposition of Western lands, a lengthy exchange that one historian has termed the greatest debate in the history of the Senate. The debate began on December 29th, when Connecticut Senator Samuel Foote offered a resolution to curtail the sale of public lands in the West. South Carolina Senator Robert Y. Hayne changed the tone of the debate on January 19th of 1830, when he argued that the federal government should leave land policy to the states and that individual states could nullify federal legislation. The remainder of the debate, which lasted through January 27th, consisted of a spirited exchange between Hayne and Massachusetts Senator Daniel Webster, who summoned all of his formidable oratorical talents in a passionate defense of the Union. But the Webster-Hayne debate was, in fact, a confrontation between Webster and Calhoun. Hayne received a steady stream of handwritten notes from the chair as he articulated Calhoun's doctrines for several hours on January 21st, and Webster clearly directed at the vice president his second reply to Hayne of January 26th and 27th. His charge that leading and distinguished gentlemen from South Carolina had reversed their stand on internal improvements brought an immediate and pointed inquiry from the vice president. Does the chair understand the gentleman from Massachusetts to say that the person now occupying the chair of the Senate had changed his opinions on the subject of internal improvements? Webster responded, "If such change has taken place, I regret it. I speak generally of the state of South Carolina." The president, although not directly involved in the debate, was clearly interested in the outcome. Jackson sympathized with advocates of states' rights, but as a passionate defender of the Union, he regarded nullification as tantamount to treason. When his friend and advisor William B. Lewis, having witnessed the sparring between Hayne and Webster from the Senate gallery, reported that Webster was demolishing our friend Hayne, the president responded with a succinct, "I expected it." An open confrontation between Jackson and Calhoun soon followed at the April 13, 1830 banquet commemorating Jefferson's birthday. The event was a long-standing tradition among congressional Republicans, but the recent use of Jefferson's writings to justify nullification imbued the 1830 celebration with particular significance. Warned in advance by Van Buren that several nullifiers were expected to attend, the president and his advisors carefully scripted his remarks. After the meal, an interminable series of toasts, Jackson rose to offer his own. "Our Union, it must be preserved." Calhoun was well prepared with an explosive rejoinder. "The Union, next to our liberty, the most dear." Jackson had the last word a few days later when he asked a South Carolina congressman about to depart for home to "give my compliments to my friends in your state and say to them that if a single drop of blood shall be shed there in opposition to the laws of the United States, I will hang the first man I can lay my hand on engaged in such treasonable conduct upon the first tree I can reach." Even without Calhoun's intransigence on the tariff and nullification, Jackson had ample reason to dislike his vice president. In May of 1830, the president finally received incontrovertible proof that Calhoun, as he had long suspected, had urged Monroe's cabinet to censure him for his invasion of Spanish Florida during the Seminole War. Demanding an explanation from Calhoun, Andrew Jackson was stunned when the vice president responded that he could not recognize the right on your part to call in question my conduct. Calhoun went on to explain that neither he, as Secretary of War, nor President Monroe had authorized the occupation of the Spanish posts in Florida, and that when orders were transcended, investigation, as a matter of course, ought to follow. His opponents had resurrected a long-forgotten incident to discredit him in Jackson's eyes. The vice president warned, "I should be blind not to see that this whole affair is a political maneuver." Thus began a lengthy and strident correspondence, which concluded only after Jackson wrote from his Tennessee home in mid-July that, "I feel no interest in this altercation, and now close this correspondence forever." And Calhoun concurred that the correspondence is far from being agreeable at this critical juncture of our affairs. Anxious to contradict inaccurate press accounts of his quarrel with the president, Calhoun published the correspondence in the United States Telegraph on February 17th and 25th of 1831, prefaced with a lengthy explanation addressed to the people of the United States. His break with Jackson, so long in the making, was now complete. Calhoun soon found himself completely eclipsed by Van Buren. After a long-standing dispute over official protocol had culminated in the resignation of the entire cabinet in April of 1831, all of Jackson's new secretaries were Van Buren men. Calhoun had his wife Floride to thank for this unfortunate development. Mrs. Calhoun, the unofficial arbiter of Washington society, had thrown the Capitol into turmoil with her deliberate snub of Secretary of War John Eaton and his wife Peggy. Peggy Eaton was a lively and attractive woman of dubious reputation and a special favorite of the president. The daughter of an innkeeper, she was clearly not the social equal of the haughty and highly critical Fluoride. She had married Eaton, a boarder at her father's hotel, soon after her first husband had died at sea. Washington scandalmongers hinted that he had taken his life in despair after learning of Peggy's affair with Eaton. Fluoride's reputation as an accomplished hostess, her husband's position, and the fact that both the president and Van Buren were widowers gave her enormous influence in Washington society. When she refused to return Peggy Eaton's calls, several of the cabinet wives followed suit. Fluoride's actions put her husband in an awkward position, but he acquiesced in her decision because he regarded social protocol as her rightful sphere of authority and because he knew that nothing he did or said would shake her resolve. The president, who considered Eaton more like a son to me than anything else, and later pronounced Peggy chaste as a virgin, was sorely offended. His outrage was compounded by memories of his late wife Rachel, who had suffered a fatal heart attack after hearing the vicious attacks on her character that the Adams camp had circulated during the presidential campaign. The Petticoat War split the cabinet for well over a year, with Van Buren emerging the winner. The shrewd and gallant widower had conspicuously entertained the Eatons and orchestrated the cabinet's resignation to resolve the impasse. Andrew Jackson was profoundly grateful to Martin Van Buren for the opportunity to purge his cabinet of John Calhoun's supporters and rewarded him with an appointment as ambassador to Great Britain. John Calhoun initially believed that his break with Jackson would only enhance his chances of winning the presidency in 1832. He still enjoyed considerable support in the South and believed he might be able to reconcile Southern agriculturalists and Northern manufacturers with selective modifications in the tariff schedules. But events in South Carolina soon forced him to make public his position on the tariff and nullification, a move that effectively killed his chances of ever becoming president. In the summer of 1831, Calhoun's protege, George McDuffie, electrified a Charleston, South Carolina audience with a fiery declamation advocating nullification and succession. Calhoun was horrified at this development, as well as by accounts that South Carolina merchants were refusing to pay duties that they considered unconstitutional. Calhoun had advanced the doctrine of nullification to provide Southern states with a peaceful mechanism for obtaining redress of their grievances, never contemplating the possibility of a disunion. He had not endorsed secession in his 1828 exposition, arguing that a state could veto and refuse to enforce any law considered unconstitutional. But if 3/4 of the states subsequently affirmed the law, the nullifying state must defer to the collective will. Until this point, John C. Calhoun had never publicly claimed authorship of his controversial doctrine, but now he felt compelled to assume control of the nullification movement to minimize its destructive potential. He published in the July 26, 1831 issue of the Pendleton, South Carolina Messenger his first public statement on nullification, the Rock Hill Address, a forceful restatement of the principles first articulated in the South Carolina Exposition. Calhoun was well aware of the risk he had assumed. "I can scarcely dare hope," he conceded shortly after the Rock Hill Address appeared in print, "that my friends to the North will sustain me in the positions I have taken. though I have the most thorough conviction that this doctrine I advanced must ultimately become those of the Union, or that it will be impossible to preserve the Union. Once the most ardent of nationalists, Calhoun would henceforth be known as the South's advocate and by Jackson supporters as a traitor. John C. Calhoun returned to Washington after a lengthy absence in time for the opening of the 22nd Congress in December of 1831. He had devoted the time since the 21st Congress had adjourned on March 3rd to nullification and to his anticipated presidential campaign. One of the first items on the Senate's agenda was the confirmation of Jackson's reconstituted cabinet. The Senate approved these nominations without incident, but Jackson's appointment of former Secretary of State Martin Van Buren as ambassador to Great Britain aroused a firestorm of controversy. Henry Clay, leading the anti-Jackson forces in the Senate, blamed Van Buren for the pernicious system of party politics adopted by the present administration, a sentiment shared by many disaffected Jacksonians and Calhoun supporters as well. Tempers flared as the Senate debated the controversial nomination on January 24th and 25th of 1832, with several senators venting to their anger at the administration. Massachusetts Senator Daniel Webster took Van Buren to task for his trade policies, while his Southern colleagues, Senator Stephen Miller of South Carolina and George Poindexter of Mississippi, took aim at Van Buren's personal life. When Missouri's Alexander Buckner rose to Van Buren's defense, asserting that only a liar would accuse Van Buren of malfeasance or misconduct, Vice President John Calhoun ruled him out of order. Georgia Senator John Forsyth, a staunch Jackson man, pointedly reminded the Vice President, "If you remember your own decisions, you must know that you are grossly out of order for this interference." Forsyth clearly intended to taunt Calhoun, not to raise a substantive objection, since the Senate had, 4 years earlier, revised its rules to authorize the presiding officer to call a member to order. The debate over Van Buren's appointment ended in a tied vote, orchestrated, one scholar suggests, to give the vice president the distinction and honor of defeating Van Buren's nomination. John Calhoun, as expected, cast his vote against the nomination, a decision that Missouri Senator Thomas Hart Benton predicted elected a vice president. But Benton was only partially correct. Rigid in defense of his principles, but wholly lacking the abundant political skills of the little magician, Calhoun had played into Van Buren's hands throughout his second term as vice president. His decision to assume control of the South Carolina nullification movement had already killed his presidential prospects. Van Buren would become the Democratic vice presidential candidate in 1832 and would succeed Jackson as president 4 years later. John Calhoun spent the remainder of the year in the Senate disheartened by the enactment of the 1832 tariff. That measure was intended to reconcile Northern manufacturers and all but the most die-hard free traders, but in one scholar's assessment, it satisfied neither protectionists nor free traders. It is, in truth, Calhoun wrote to a kinsman as the Senate labored over the tariff in early March of 1832, hard to find a middle position where the principle of protection is asserted to be essential on one side and fatal on the other. It involves not the question of concession, but surrender. In early July, a despairing Calhoun offered a gloomy precis of the Senate's action on the tariff. "We have spent a long and fruitless season. The tariff bill was late last evening, ordered to the 3rd. reading in the Senate with many amendments, all going to increase the burden on us. Every Southern member voted against it, including the Southwest, with the exception of the senators from Louisiana. The question is no longer one of free trade, but liberty and despotism. The hope of the country now rests on our gallant little state. Let every Carolinian do his duty. To those who do not join us now, intend unqualified submission. Now, the end of his political career as Senator Calhoun. In South Carolina, where anti-tariff sentiments had reached a fever pitch, Calhoun found it increasingly difficult to contain the deadly forces that he had unwittingly unleashed. Nullifiers gained control of the state legislature in the fall of 1832 election. The new legislature promptly called for a nullification convention, which passed an ordinance declaring the 1828 and 1832 tariffs void as of February 1st of 1833. The ordinance of nullification also warned that if the administration resorted to coercion to collect the offensive duties, South Carolina would proceed to organize a separate government. An irate Jackson ordered reinforcements to the federal installations surrounding Charleston Harbor, but soon announced his support for a revised tariff. On December 10th, he proclaimed nullification incompatible with the existence of the Union. Calhoun would help defuse this explosive situation, but not as vice president. Elected to the Senate to replace Robert Hayne, he resigned the vice presidency on December 28th of 1832, more than 2 months before his term was up. Except for a brief stint as Secretary of State during John Tyler's administration, he spent the rest of his life in the Senate, valiantly defending his state, attempting to reconcile its interests with those of the nation at large. Undaunted by rumors that Jackson intended to try him for treason if the impasse over nullification resulted in an armed confrontation, Calhoun joined forces with Henry Clay to help guide through the Senate a revised tariff acceptable to the Southern states. The nullifiers, encouraged by the prospect of a more equitable tariff and counseled by cool-headed emissaries from Virginia to show restraint, postponed the effective date of the ordinance until March 4th. Jackson's supporters had, in the meantime, introduced a measure to force South Carolina's compliance with the old tariff, which passed the Senate by an overwhelming margin. Calhoun and 8 of his fellow senators stalked out of the chamber in protest when the Senate adopted the force bill, but Jackson never had occasion to employ its provision against the nullifiers. The crisis passed after Congress approved both the revised tariff and the force bill shortly before adjourning on March 3rd of 1833. John Calhoun returned to South Carolina, firmly convinced that nullification had dealt the fatal blow to the tariff. For the next several years, John Calhoun remained aloof from the Jacksonian coalition, which had become known as the Democratic Party. But during Van Buren's administration from 1837 to 1841, Calhoun set aside his long-standing aversion to the little magician and risked the wrath of his fellow South Carolinians to support the independent treasury plan, Van Buren's solution to the credit and currency problems that he and Calhoun believed responsible for the 1837 Depression. Alarmed at the prospect that Whig presidential candidate William Henry Harrison would back tariff concessions for special interests, Calhoun rejoined the Democrats in 1840 and began making plans to enter the 1844 presidential race. Hoping to present himself as an independent candidate with no institutional affiliation, John Calhoun resigned from the Senate on March 3rd of 1843. His campaign faltered, however, when several prominent Virginia Democrats backed Van Buren and the New York City Convention followed suit. Calhoun consoled himself by focusing his attention on his farm, badly in debt after several years of depressed cotton prices, and his family torn by protracted financial disputes between Calhoun's son, Andrew Pickens Calhoun, and his son-in-law, Thomas Green Clemson. In mid-March of 1844, he accepted President John Tyler's offer of an appointment to succeed Secretary of State Abel Upshur, who had been killed by an exploding cannon during an outing on the ship Princeton. Calhoun remained at the State Department until Tyler's term ended on March 3rd of 1845, participating in the final stages of the negotiations for the Texas Annexation Treaty. Calhoun returned to the Senate in November of 1845 and remained there for the rest of his life. Increasingly defensive about the institution of slavery as the abolition movement gained momentum and agitated at the growing discord between the slaveholding and free states, he spoke, as he informed the Senate in 1847, as a Southern man and a slaveholder. As Secretary of State, Calhoun had strongly supported the annexation of Texas. After Pennsylvania Representative David Wilmot offered his famous proviso as an amendment to an administration war bill, however, the South Carolina senator realized that the acquisition of additional territory would inevitably heighten the sectional conflict over slavery. The Wilmot proviso, which would have barred slavery from all lands acquired from Mexico, pushed Calhoun into the anti-administration camp. He vehemently opposed the war policy of President James K. Polk, warning that the acquisition of Mexican territory, with its population of pure Indians and by far the larger portion of the residue mixed blood, would corrupt the nation's culture and institutions. By 1850, the precarious balance between the slaveholding and free states was again at risk. California's petition to enter the Union as a free state threatened to upset the delicate equilibrium. Other unresolved issues, too, including slavery in the District of Columbia and the enforcement of fugitive slave laws, loomed large on the horizon during the final weeks of Calhoun's life. To resolve the impasse, Calhoun's old friend and rival, Henry Clay, on January 29th of 1850, offered a series of proposals, collectively known as the Compromise of 1850. Clay proposed that California enter the Union as a free state and that Congress agreed to impose no restrictions on slavery in the New Mexico and Utah territories. The compromise also provided that Congress would not prohibit or regulate slavery in the District of Columbia, would abolish the slave trade in the district, and would require northern states to comply with fugitive slave laws. Massachusetts Senator Daniel Webster sought Calhoun's support for the compromise, but the South Carolinian vehemently opposed to abolishing the slave trade in the nation's capital and admitting California as a free state, refused to endorse the plan. On March 4th, a dispirited and emaciated Calhoun, his body so ravaged by tuberculosis that he could no longer walk unassisted, and his once penetrating voice so weak that he could no longer speak, presented his final address to the Senate. Virginia Senator James Mason spoke for Calhoun, who sat nearby, his pitiful frame huddled in his chair. Only an only an immediate halt to anti-slavery agitation and a constitutional amendment to preserve the balance between North and South would save the Union, Calhoun warned. Even senators who had long considered Calhoun a disunionist were shocked when Mason pronounced his ultimatum. If the northern states were unwilling to reconcile their differences with the South on the broad principle of justice and duty, say so and let the states we both represent agree to separate and part in peace. 3 days later, Senator Webster delivered his famous 7th of March speech, a ringing plea for compromise and union that Calhoun interrupted with a resolute, "No, sir, the Union can be broken," one of his last utterances in the Senate. The Senate ultimately approved Clay's compromise not as a package, but as separate items. Calhoun died on March 31st of 1850, convinced that his beloved South would one day withdraw from the Union he had labored so long and hard to strengthen and preserve. Even in death, he was a controversial figure. Senator Thomas Hart Benton refused to speak at the April 5th memorial service in the Senate chamber. Calhoun was not dead, he maintained. There may be no vitality in his body, but there is in his doctrines. Senator Daniel Webster, one of the official mourners chosen by the Senate to accompany Calhoun's body to South Carolina, could not bring himself to perform this awkward and painful task. He took his lead from Calhoun at the Virginia landing as the funeral party departed for the South. John Calhoun was buried in Charleston, South Carolina, in a crypt in St. Philip's Churchyard. So real quickly, before we get into some fun facts and stuff about Calhoun, the 1828 United States presidential election, that was Andrew Jackson versus John Quincy Adams. Jackson won, of course, very controversial again, and John C. Calhoun was his running mate. So that's how Calhoun got his second term of being vice president under the Jackson administration. That was the election of 1828. You'll see here the electoral vote count was Jackson 178, Quincy Adams 83. Jackson carried 15 states to Quincy Adams 9, and Jackson won like over 55% of the popular vote. So Jackson won, very controversial, of course, and you'll actually see here, just some maps and some of that kind of stuff regarding the 1828 election. That's pretty much it when it comes to the elections. There's really nothing else to kind of really of note, regarding anything else with Calhoun, because we know obviously then Van Buren took over as vice president and such. So there you go. 1828 presidential election as well. Now what I'm going to read you is just some fun facts, some kind of overviews. Same thing, similar to what I've already read, but just different context, different sites and such that I'm using. So here we go. Some fun things, fun facts about Calhoun. John C. Calhoun was a prominent U.S. statesman and spokesman for the slave plantation system of the antebellum South. As a young congressman from South Carolina, he helped steer the United States into war with Great Britain and established the Second Bank of the United States. Calhoun went on to serve as U.S. Secretary of War, Vice President, and briefly as Secretary of State. As a longtime South Carolina senator, he opposed the Mexican-American War and the admission of California as a free state, and was renowned as a leading voice for those seeking to secure the institution of slavery. A nationalist at the outset of his political career, Calhoun was one of the leading war hawks who maneuvered the unprepared United States into war with Great Britain in 1812. After the Treaty of Ghent that ended that conflict, Calhoun was responsible for establishing the Second Bank of the United States, and he wrote the bonus bill that would have laid the foundation for a nationwide network of roads and canals if President James Madison had not vetoed it. A candidate for presidency in 1824, Calhoun was the object of bitter partisan attacks from other contenders. Dropping out of the race, he settled for the vice presidency and was twice elected to that position. But after Andrew Jackson's assumption of the presidency in 1829, Calhoun found himself isolated politically in national affairs. At first, he supported the Tariff of 1828, the so-called Tariff of Abominations, but responding to his constituents' criticism of the measure and believing that the tariff was being unfairly assessed on the agrarian South for the benefit of an industrializing North, Calhoun drafted for the South Carolina legislature his exposition and protest. In this essay, he claimed original sovereignty for the people acting through the states and advocated state veto or nullification of any national law that was held to impinge on minority interests. He later developed the argument in his two essays, Disquisition of Government and Discourse on the Constitution, presenting the classic case for minority rights within the framework of majority rule. A moderate during the nullification crisis of 1832 and 1833, Calhoun joined with Henry Clay in working out the compromise tariff. By the end, he had resigned from the vice presidency and had been elected a senator from South Carolina. For the rest of his life, he defended the slave plantation system against a growing anti-slavery stance in the free states. He continued his strident defense of slavery even after he joined the Tyler administration as Secretary of State. In that position, he laid the groundwork for the annexation of Texas and the settlement of the Oregon boundary with Great Britain. Re-elected to the Senate in 1845, he opposed the Mexican-American War because he felt American victory would result in territorial concessions that would place the Union at jeopardy. Similarly, he opposed the admission of California as a free state and the free soil provision in the Oregon Territorial Bill. In his last address to the Senate, he foretold the disruption of the Union unless the slave states were given adequate and permanent protection for their institutions. Calhoun, along with Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson, dominated American political life from 1815 to 1850. A tall, spare individual, Calhoun was a gifted debater, an original thinker in political theory, and a person of broad learning who was especially well-read in philosophy, history, and contemporary economic and social issues. His public appearance as the so-called cast iron man was belied by his personal warmth and affectionate nature in private life. So there you go, a little bit more about Calhoun. What else can I give you? Some brief biography, some facts. Let me read some more for you. So as I said, John C. Calhoun was a political figure from South Carolina who played a major role in national affairs during the early 19th century. Calhoun was at the center of the Nullification crisis, served in the cabinet of Andrew Jackson, and was a senator representing South Carolina. He became iconic for his role in defending the positions of the South. Calhoun was considered a member of the great triumvirate of senators along with Kentucky's Henry Clay representing the West and Daniel Webster of Massachusetts representing the North. As I said, he was born on March 18th of 1782 in rural South Carolina, and he died at the age of 68 on March 31st of 1850, died actually in Washington, D.C. He entered public service when he was elected to the South Carolina legislature in 1808, and in 1810 he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. We know all this. We know about the Nullification, of course. He was a defender of enslavement and the South, big time. Calhoun has remained controversial. Even many decades after his death, a residential college at Yale University was named for Calhoun in the early 20th century. That honor for a defender of enslavement was challenged over the years, and protests were held against the name in early 2016. In the spring of 2016, the administration of Yale announced that Calhoun College would retain its name. So he's definitely one of those very polarizing figures. There's definitely no doubt about that. Here's a pretty good quote. This is actually a quote from Andrew Jackson about John C. Calhoun. John Calhoun, if you succeed from my nation, I will succeed your head from the rest of your body. Oh boy. That was a quote from Jackson to Calhoun. Pretty interesting. So I think that's pretty much it as far as, telling you about Calhoun. We went over it. He was vice president under John Quincy Adams. Then he kind of changed his stances and he became kind of a Jackson guy. And then he was vice president under Andrew Jackson. But that relationship was very tumultuous and that ended pretty abruptly. And, they did not like each other at all. And, so it just was very interesting. And Calhoun was definitely a slaveholder. He had enslaved people. He owned enslaved people. And he was a big-time proponent and defender of slavery. And he was all about the South. And he was not shy about, basically seceding from the Union. He was not shy about it. He made his stance very clear that he thought that Southern states should secede from the Union if slavery was going to be abolished. So he definitely was not shy about that before he died. Now, just a little bit about his death. John Calhoun died at what was known as the Old Brick Capitol boarding house in Washington, D.C. on March 31st of 1850. He died of tuberculosis at the age of 68. The last words attributed to him were, "The South, the poor South." Now, that Old Brick Capitol boarding house is actually the exact location of where the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. now stands in present day. That Old Brick Capitol boarding house has long been gone, of course, and where the Supreme Court building, that's the exact location of where it was, and that's the exact location of where Calhoun died. There used to be, someone told me, there used to be a sign outside of the Supreme Court building or that building years ago that stated that John C. Calhoun died here on, March 31st of 1850. Supposedly, that sign was still inside of the Supreme Court building. There's a museum that's open to the public inside the Supreme Court building. It's like a Supreme Court museum and that kind of thing. But they had a little section that stated that this used to be the location of the Old Brick Capitol boarding house, and it's where Calhoun died, and they had that sign on display at the museum. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court building right now and that museum are closed to the public due to COVID concerns and restrictions, so I'm not able to go there. I'm going to try to see if I can find a picture of that sign that maybe I can find online. If I do find it, keep in mind it's a stock photo. It's not mine. I'm not sure if I'll even be able to find one, but I'll look. But yeah, so he died in Washington, D.C. John Calhoun was then interred at St. Philip's Churchyard in Charleston, South Carolina. During the Civil War, a group of Calhoun's friends were concerned about the possible desecration of his grave by federal troops, and during the night removed his coffin to a hiding place under the stairs of the church. The next night, his coffin was buried in an unmarked grave near the church, where it remained until 1871, when it was again exhumed and returned to its original place. After John Calhoun had died, an associate suggested that Senator Thomas Hart Benton give a eulogy in honor of Calhoun on the floor of the Senate. Benton, a devoted Unionist, declined, saying, "He is not dead, sir. He is not dead. There may be no vitality in his body, but there is in his doctrines." The Clemson University campus in South Carolina occupies the site of Calhoun's Fort Hill plantation, which he bequeathed to his wife and daughter. They sold it and its 50 slaves to a relative. When that owner died, Thomas Green Clemson foreclosed the mortgage. He later bequeathed the property to the state for use as an agricultural college to be named after him. John C. Calhoun's widow, Floride, died on July 25th of 1866, and she is buried at St. Paul's Episcopal Church Cemetery in Pendleton, South Carolina, near their children, but she is apart from her husband. So there you go, John C. Calhoun. I did visit the St. Philip's Churchyard down there in beautiful, amazing, historic Charleston, South Carolina. One of my favorite cities and favorite places I visited. Absolutely love Charleston, South Carolina. It is amazing. Actually, the St. Philip's Churchyard was closed when I went. It was not open. It was because of COVID. This was last year in 2020. It was closed. The gate was locked. You could not get in. But let's just say somehow I found my way in. I don't know how that happened, but I found my way in. So anyway, you'll see my pictures. I'll show them at the end here of my visit to John C. Calhoun's grave. And I'll also show you the actual St. Philip's Church there, because it's that churchyard where he's buried. It's amazing. Love it. Calhoun's tomb is really cool. It's big. It's just very cool. What a historic, awesome place. If you have the opportunity to go to Charleston, South Carolina, go. It is amazing. It's awesome. So, there you go. Look at the life, legacy, death, and burial site of John C. Calhoun, our 7th Vice President of the United States. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for all the support. Keep all those comments and questions coming. We love those, of course. Henry will be back with me next week. And stay tuned, because next week will be our next installment. And we're going to be taking a look. Now, technically, the next vice president is Martin Van Buren. We're not going to be taking a look at him because I already did a video on him in our presidential series. So we're going to be skipping ahead to the 9th vice president of the United States, who is Richard Mentor Johnson. That will be next week's vice presidential installment. So stay tuned for that. Thanks, guys. Thanks for everything. Appreciate it very much. Hope you enjoyed. And we will see you next week. Bye-bye, guys. Hey guys, how's it going? TJ here, of course, with Dead History. So I wanted to bring you guys a little bit of bonus footage. Unfortunately, I did not make it down to South Carolina, of course. So what I wanted to do is give you kind of some obscure bonus footage, some stuff that I thought would be kind of interesting. And the first bit of bonus footage I'm going to show you here today is actually regarding Malin Dickerson. And if you guys recall, we actually discussed Malin Dickerson in where him and John Randolph, they got into a whole debate. In New Jersey Senator Malin Dickerson, he had spoken at great length the previous day. And there was like a whole big thing. It was a big fallout, a big explosive session of Congress on March 30th of 1826. And New Jersey Senator Malin Dickerson was a huge part of that. And we just went over that in part 2. So I wanted to show you, the first thing I'm going to show you here is the Malin Dickerson Reservation, which is actually a beautiful wooded area. It's basically kind of up in Lake Hopatcong. Anybody that knows New Jersey, Morris County area, it's in the Lake Hopatcong area of New Jersey. Beautiful northwest area, wilderness and lakes and mountains and black bears and everything you can name. So here's a look at the Malin Dickerson Reservation, named after him, and a monument, a little memorial to Malin Dickerson. So take a look here. Hey guys, how's it going? TJ here with Dead History. And I am actually at the Malin Dickerson Reservation here in up in Jefferson, New Jersey. Let me flip you guys around. There you go. It's not a bad view for you guys. Not bad at all. For anybody that says New Jersey isn't pretty. Got some fall colors. So, this is the Malin Dickerson Reservation. And Malin Dickerson, of course, we just learned about him in this part 2. There supposedly is like a boulder with a plaque dedicated, like a little memorial to Dickerson somewhere here, and I can't seem to find it. I'm going to look a little further and then kind of move on, but I did want to show you guys this. Thought this was a pretty cool area, but this whole reservation is named after Malin Dickerson, so pretty cool stuff. So, there you go. Got some pretty scenery. Figured you guys would like that. Can't beat that, right? If nothing else, you got nice scenery here. I'll check back in with you guys. Thanks. So I ended up finding the the monument. So here you go. I'm gonna flip you guys around. There you go. As you can see, we're right here in the woods. Pretty cool, but there's this boulder, and right here it tells you this reservation is named in memory of Malin Dickerson, born April 17th of 1770, died October 5th of 1853. He served his county and country as an outstanding citizen and statesman, assemblyman in Morris County. He was governor of New Jersey. He was United States Senator, and then he was Secretary of the Navy. So there you go, Malin Dickerson. So you guys just learned about him in this part 2 of the JohnCCalhoun video. There was a pretty cool story about that debate and everything that Dickerson was involved in, and Calhoun interjected and blah, blah, blah. So there you go. Pretty cool stuff. Thanks, guys. So we go from the Malin Dickerson Reservation up there in Lake Hopatcong, New Jersey, and now we're going to take a look at the burial site, the grave site of Malin Dickerson. He is actually buried at the First Presbyterian Church in Susquehanna, New Jersey. Susquehanna is in Morris County, New Jersey, not far from the reservation I just showed you, only about maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes away. Susquehanna, can you tell the Native American, local Indian type tribes that were present in this Northwest New Jersey area, obviously, many years ago. A lot of Native American town names and that sort of thing up in this area of New Jersey. So pretty cool stuff. So here it is, the gravesite of Malin Dickerson. He was also Secretary of War under Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren. So he was Secretary of War, so he was a presidential cabinet member, and he was also the 7th governor of the state of New Jersey. So pretty cool. But this is the guy that had that kind of debate there in Congress that you guys learned about. Here's his gravesite in Susquehanna, New Jersey. Malin Dickerson. Take a look. Hey guys, how's it going? TJ here with Dead History, and let me turn you around, show you where I'm at. So, pretty nice cemetery here, and this right here is actually the gravesite of Malin Dickerson. So we learned all about him in this part 2, and yeah, here he is buried right here. He was actually the I believe the 7th governor of the state of New Jersey. He was also a Secretary of the Navy. So there you go. This is where Malin Dickerson is buried, here at the First Presbyterian Church here in New Jersey. We're up in Morris County, New Jersey. It's kind of like northwestern part of the state. So kind of give you guys a view here. There you go. Pretty cool stuff. So there you go. The guy we just learned about in this part 2, Malin Dickerson. He was also a senator from New Jersey. There it is. That's where he's buried, right here. Figured I'd show you guys. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed this little obscure tidbit of bonus footage for a look at Malin Dickerson. Thanks, guys. So the other gravesite I wanted to show you that is kind of, it's the reason I want to show you guys this, to be completely honest, is yes, it does have ties, of course, with John C. Calhoun. But this man has ties with many of those early, really important historical and political figures of, like, back then in the, late 1700s throughout, to the mid 1800s. And that's Henry Clay. Henry Clay was obviously a congressman. He was a U.S. senator. He was actually one of the founders of the Whig Party. He was also known, his nickname was the Great Compromiser. Henry Clay, very instrumental in American politics, early American politics, and very instrumental with John C. Calhoun, who we just learned about. So I'm going to show you his grave here. This is actually at the Lexington Cemetery in Lexington, Kentucky. And the very cool thing, I will tell you, this cemetery was one of my favorite cemeteries that I ever visited. And as you guys know who watch this channel, I have visited a lot of cemeteries throughout the country, and the Lexington Cemetery there in Lexington, Kentucky, is one of my all-time favorites. I thought it was stunning. I thought it was beautiful. I thought it was really cool, really old and historic. And Henry Clay's huge memorial and monument and tomb is awesome. It's a sight to see. So take a look. That's what these pictures are here. The tomb and gravesite of Henry Clay. And then last but not least, I'm going to show you all of my photos from my visit to the gravesite, to the tomb of our 7th Vice President of the United States, John Caldwell Calhoun. John C. Calhoun's tomb and gravesite is right there at the St. Philip's Churchyard Cemetery in beautiful, historic Charleston, South Carolina. I can sincerely say, I said it during the end of part 2, Charleston, South Carolina is literally one of my favorite cities that I visited. It's just steeped in history. It is so amazing, so beautiful, so picturesque. I loved it. I absolutely loved Charleston. This was my visit. This cemetery and the gates were actually locked and closed when I visited, but I somehow made my way in. So these are my pictures of me visiting the gravesite of John C. Calhoun at the St. Philip's Churchyard there in Charleston, South Carolina. One of my favorite places of all time. Take a look here. Thanks, guys.